November 19th, 1941. Late afternoon on the Indian Ocean, roughly 150 nautical miles off Western Australia near Dirk Hartog Island. The sea looked calm, almost polished, the horizon a hard line under a lowering sun. HMAS Sydney moved through it at patrol speed, a modern light cruiser with the confidence of a ship that had already proved itself in war. On board were 645 officers and sailors. Men checked instruments, cleaned fittings, watched the wake, and waited for the next signal. The heat sat heavy on the steel decks. Salt clung to clothes and skin. The radio room heard little beyond routine traffic. Out here, far from Europe, the war could feel distant, until it did not. A lookout reported smoke. At first it was only a smear against the light, then a clearer column rising from a single ship on the horizon. Merchant vessel, the kind Sydney was expected to challenge, identify, and, if necessary, control. Captain Joseph Burnett ordered the cruiser toward it. This was procedure. In a theatre where German raiders hid among neutral shipping, procedure was meant to prevent mistakes and protect trade. As the range closed, the unknown ship showed the markings of a Dutch freighter and flew neutral colors. To the naked eye, it looked ordinary, a cargo ship riding low, moving with no urgency. Yet small details could matter. The silhouette did not quite match expectations. The course seemed uncertain, as if the ship was buying time. Sydney continued in, because a warship that fired first at a neutral vessel could create its own disaster. By about 4 p.m., Sydney was close enough for visual signals to begin. Flag hoists went up. Questions were sent. Identity, destination, call sign. The response came back as Strat Malacca, a name that sounded plausible in these waters. Burnett pressed for the secret call sign that would confirm it. The gap between the ships narrowed to a range where guns would be decisive and torpedoes would be impossible to evade. But the freighter was not what it claimed to be. Behind false panels and cargo fittings sat hidden weapons and a crew at concealed action stations. The ship was HSK Cormoran, a German auxiliary cruiser, an armed raider built to deceive, to ambush, and to vanish again into open ocean. For Cormoran's commander, Theodore Detmers, the appearance of Sydney meant danger at its purest. Sydney was faster, stronger, and trained for gunnery. There would be no clean escape. The only advantage left was surprise, and surprise required distance to collapse to almost nothing. In the next minutes, two ships would turn from cautious strangers into enemies firing at point-blank range. By nightfall, both would be sinking. One crew would live to be found. The other would not send a distress call, would not leave a witness, and would not bring a single survivor home. Australia's most famous cruiser would disappear with all hands, and the ocean would keep the reasons, whether mistake, bad luck, or something darker, locked away for decades. By late 1941, the wider war had stretched across continents and oceans. Europe had been fighting for more than 2 years. Nazi Germany controlled much of the continent. Britain stood under constant pressure, its resources strained, its merchant shipping hunted in the Atlantic and beyond. The Mediterranean remained contested, with naval battles shaping the flow of troops and supplies to North Africa. In Asia and the Pacific, tension was rising. Japan expanded its reach across China and Southeast Asia. Diplomatic relations with Western powers were deteriorating. Although the attack on Pearl Harbor had not yet occurred, many naval planners sensed that a wider Pacific conflict was approaching. Australia, geographically distant from Europe, yet closely tied to Britain, faced growing uncertainty about its own security. The Royal Australian Navy was relatively small. Its major units were divided between commitments overseas and patrol duties closer to home. Shipping routes along Australia's western coast were vital. Troops, equipment, fuel, and raw materials moved through these waters on their way to the Middle East and Europe. Disruption here would not only weaken Allied logistics, but also expose Australia's long coastline to fear and speculation. HMAS Sydney played a central role in that defensive posture. She was a modified Leander-class light cruiser armed with 8 6-inch guns, torpedoes, and modern fire control systems. Fast and maneuverable, she had already earned distinction in July 1940 by defeating the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni near Crete. That victory gave her a reputation that reached far beyond naval circles. In Australia, her name carried weight. She symbolised competence and resolve. After service in the Mediterranean, Sydney returned home in early 1941. Her mission shifted from fleet engagements to patrol and escort duties in the Indian Ocean. Intelligence reports warned of German auxiliary cruisers operating far from Europe. These raiders, known as Hilfskreuzer, were converted merchant ships fitted with concealed guns, torpedoes, and mines. Their purpose was to attack Allied merchant shipping without warning, then disappear under new identities. Among them was HSK Cormoran, commanded by Fregattenkapitän Theodor Detmers. Since leaving Europe in 1940, she had captured or sunk 11 Allied vessels, accounting for more than 68,000 tons of shipping. Her success depended not on strength, but on deception. She sailed under false flags, altered her silhouette, and changed her appearance to match different national profiles. Her survival relied on avoiding direct confrontation with warships. By November 1941, both ships operated in the same vast theatre for different reasons. Sydney hunted raiders to protect supply lines. Cormoran hunted merchantmen to break them. The encounter between them was not inevitable, but the conditions made it possible. A single misjudgment at sea, a moment of hesitation, or a strict adherence to peacetime identification rules could shift the balance. What was at stake extended beyond 2 hulls of steel. For Australia, the loss of a cruiser would represent a strategic setback and a psychological blow. Confidence in coastal defence would be shaken. Families across the country depended on these ships for protection, even if they rarely saw them. In this environment of global strain and regional vulnerability, the meeting off Western Australia was not an isolated event. It was part of a wider contest in which speed, discipline, and interpretation of international law could decide life or death within minutes. Captain Joseph Burnett was 42 years old in November 1941. He had entered naval service as a young man and built his career steadily through years of training and sea duty. Born in England and raised in Australia, he belonged to a generation of officers shaped by both imperial tradition and emerging Australian identity. Colleagues regarded him as careful, disciplined, and loyal to procedure. He was not known for recklessness. He trusted established rules and expected others to follow them. In May 1941, Burnett assumed command of HMAS Sydney. The appointment carried prestige and pressure. Sydney was not simply another cruiser. She was a symbol of national pride after her Mediterranean victory. Commanding her meant representing the Royal Australian Navy at its most visible level. Burnett approached the role with seriousness. He understood the responsibility that came with 645 lives under his authority. At home, his family followed news of the war through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Letters travelled slowly but steadily between ship and shore. Like many naval officers, Burnett balanced professional duty with private concern. This patrol off Western Australia was expected to be routine. There was no indication that it would become decisive. The crew reflected Australia itself. Some were seasoned sailors who had seen combat in the Mediterranean. Others were young recruits who joined after hearing of Sydney's earlier success. Ages ranged from late teens to middle age. They came from city suburbs, rural towns, and coastal communities. On board, rank defined authority, but shared routine created familiarity. Men worked in gunnery crews, engine rooms, signal stations, kitchens, and medical spaces. They relied on drills and training to maintain readiness. Most believed their ship superior to anything a disguised raider might field. Her armour, main battery, and fire control equipment gave confidence. Drills reinforced that belief. Even in uncertain waters, routine inspections, watch rotations, and maintenance provided structure. Few expected a confrontation at extremely close range with a vessel posing as neutral. Opposing them was Fregattenkapitän Theodor Detmers, aged 39. A career officer in the German Navy, he commanded HSK Cormoran with a different set of calculations. His ship was not designed to defeat cruisers in open battle. It survived through disguise and careful timing. Detmers had spent months refining false identities, adjusting paint schemes, altering rigging, and instructing his crew to perform convincingly as merchant sailors. He understood that any direct fight with a modern warship would likely end in destruction. His men were trained to move from routine appearance to combat readiness in seconds. Hidden behind fabricated cargo panels were 150mm guns and torpedo tubes. The illusion of harmless trade concealed deliberate preparation. By November 1941, Detmers and his crew had endured nearly a year at sea. Isolation sharpened discipline. Supplies were limited. Encounters with merchant vessels had followed a pattern. Approach under false colors, close distance, reveal weapons only when necessary. Survival depended on calm execution. The meeting between Burnett and Detmers brought two contrasting command styles into sudden proximity. One operated within established naval protocols meant to prevent misidentification and unlawful attack. The other relied on exploiting those very protocols. Neither commander sought a symmetrical duel. Each acted according to his mission and training. Within half an hour, decisions made by both men would remove any possibility of correction. Procedure, deception, and timing would combine into a chain of events that no one aboard Sydney would survive to describe. Shortly after 4 p.m., Captain Burnett faced what appeared to be a routine verification. The unidentified vessel had identified itself as the Dutch freighter Straat Malacca, a legitimate name listed in naval records. It flew Dutch colours and responded to visual signals. Under international maritime law, a warship was expected to confirm identity before taking hostile action against a vessel claiming neutrality. Yet inconsistencies began to surface. The silhouette did not perfectly match reference profiles. The superstructure lines seemed slightly altered. The ship's movements were cautious, even hesitant. Still, none of this amounted to proof of deception. In wartime, merchant captains were nervous. Courses changed, paint schemes varied. Burnett could not justify opening fire without certainty. Standard protocol required closing to visual range. Signal flags were raised again. The cruiser demanded the vessel's secret call sign, a coded identifier known only to legitimate Allied or neutral ships. If the freighter failed to provide it, the situation would change immediately. As the range decreased, the tactical balance shifted in ways that were not immediately visible. On board the supposed freighter, Fregattenkapitän Detmers understood the danger. His ship could not outrun Sydney. Attempting to flee would expose the deception and invite long-range gunfire from a superior opponent. Radioing for help was impossible. Surrender meant captivity and the end of his mission. His only option was to maintain the disguise for as long as possible. Behind false deckhouses and concealed panels, gun crews stood ready. 6 150mm guns were masked behind hinged structures designed to drop away at a signal. Torpedo tubes were loaded and aimed. Every man had rehearsed this moment. Silence was critical. No premature movement could betray their identity. The two ships drew closer until less than 1,000 meters separated them. At such a distance, the advantages of armor and fire control systems narrowed sharply. A torpedo launched at that range would have little time to be evaded. Secondary guns could inflict severe damage within seconds. The rules designed to prevent wrongful attack were now working against the better-armed vessel. Burnett continued to demand confirmation. The signal for the secret call sign was sent again. The Dutch freighter failed to respond correctly. The delay stretched the tension further. Each passing second increased the risk for both commanders. Detmers later stated that he waited until he was certain the cruiser was about to uncover the deception. If he hesitated longer, Sydney might open fire first from a position of advantage. If he acted too early, he might lose the element of surprise. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the moment of decision arrived. Detmers ordered the Dutch flag struck and the German naval ensign raised. Concealment panels fell away. Hidden guns were exposed. The order followed immediately. Open fire. In that instant, the problem ceased to be procedural and became fatal. Two ships that had been maneuvering under the pretense of inspection were now locked in combat at point-blank range. There was no room for repositioning, no gradual escalation. The first salvos would determine everything. For Sydney, the proximity eliminated her margin of safety. For Cormoran, it was the only condition under which survival was possible. The trap had been set, and it had closed. Within seconds, discipline, deception, and adherence to regulation would collide in an exchange of fire that neither crew could reverse. At approximately 5:32 p.m., the first German salvo struck. Cormoran's concealed guns fired almost simultaneously. Shells crossed the short distance in seconds. The opening hits were decisive. The Australian cruiser's bridge area was struck early, disabling command positions and likely killing or severely wounding senior officers. Communication lines between control stations were cut. Range-finding equipment was damaged before it could be fully brought to bear. The effect was immediate and disorienting. Smoke and debris filled the upper decks. Without central coordination, individual gun crews reacted on training and instinct. Despite the shock, Sydney returned fire. Her forward turrets engaged at close range. Heavy 6-inch shells found their mark. Several struck Cormoran, penetrating vital spaces. One hit disabled the German raider's engine room. Machinery was shattered. Power failed. Cormoran lost propulsion and began to drift, flames spreading through compartments already vulnerable to fire. For a brief moment, both ships were striking each other with lethal accuracy. But the initial advantage remained with the attacker. Torpedoes had been launched from Cormoran during the first minutes of engagement. At least one struck Sydney forward, below the waterline. The explosion tore into the bow section, causing extensive flooding. The impact compounded earlier shell damage. The cruiser's forward structure was now compromised both by fire above and water below. Between 5:35 and 5:45 p.m., the exchange intensified. Shell splashes surrounded both vessels. Secondary batteries fired rapidly. Metal fragments and blast pressure swept exposed decks. Damage control teams aboard Sydney attempted to contain fires and seal flooding compartments, but coordination was impaired. With the bridge destroyed and communications disrupted, efforts became fragmented. Cormoran, though crippled, continued to fight. Her guns maintained pressure on the Australian cruiser's superstructure. Fires on both ships grew larger, fed by fuel, ammunition, and shattered fittings. By around 5:45 p.m., Sydney began to turn away. Whether the maneuver was intentional or the result of steering damage remains uncertain. Observers from Cormoran later reported that the cruiser moved southward, still firing intermittently. Her silhouette showed heavy smoke rising from multiple points. The battle devolved into a scene of chaos. Both ships were burning. Explosions echoed across the water. Shell flashes illuminated the late afternoon sky. What had begun as a controlled identification had become a close-range struggle between two mortally damaged vessels. Between 6 o'clock and 6:15 p.m., the intensity lessened. Sydney's rate of fire slowed. Individual salvos appeared irregular. Damage had likely disabled additional turrets. Flames were visible along the length of the ship. The cruiser no longer maintained steady course control. On board Cormoran, the situation was equally dire. Fires had spread beyond containment. Ammunition stores were threatened. Without engines, the raider was helpless against the growing inferno. Detmers assessed the damage and recognized that the ship could not be saved. By approximately 6:30 p.m., he gave the order to abandon ship. German sailors lowered lifeboats and rafts in relatively organized fashion. Despite fire and smoke, evacuation procedures were followed. Injured men were assisted where possible. Once clear, they watched their ship burn against the darkening horizon. In the distance, Sydney remained visible, a mass of smoke and flame drifting south. Some German survivors later stated that they saw the Australian cruiser fire what appeared to be a final salvo around 6:45 p.m. After that, gunfire ceased. As night approached, visibility diminished. The burning glow of the cruiser was still visible for some time, then gradually faded. The sea swallowed sound and light alike. Around 11:30 p.m., Detmers ordered scuttling charges detonated aboard Cormoran. The raider sank stern first into the Indian Ocean. Her crew, 399 men, were now adrift in lifeboats and rafts, but alive. Somewhere to the south, HMAS Sydney was still out there. By dawn, no sign of her remained. After darkness settled on November 19, 1941, HMAS Sydney drifted alone to the south of the battle site. Fires burned across multiple decks. The forward section had absorbed severe torpedo damage. Shell impacts had shattered upper structures. With the bridge destroyed early in the fight, organised command had likely broken down within minutes of the first salvo. The ship was mortally wounded. Survivors on board, possibly numbering in the hundreds, would have faced immediate and conflicting priorities. Flooding in forward compartments required rapid countermeasures. Fires needed suppression before they reached ammunition stores. Injured men required attention. Yet communication systems were damaged or destroyed. Orders could not travel efficiently through smoke-filled passageways. Electrical failures reduced lighting. Heat and toxic fumes spread. In these conditions, discipline alone could not restore control. If evacuation was attempted, it would have been fragmented. Lifeboats may have been damaged or inaccessible due to fire and list. Launching rafts in darkness, amid flames and explosions, required coordination that the crippled ship may no longer have possessed. Some men might have entered the water individually, but the distance to land, over 100 miles, offered little chance of survival. Meanwhile, fires continued to advance. The torpedo hit forward likely compromised the integrity of the bow. Ammunition for the main guns was stored in magazines below. These magazines were protected by armour and designed to resist external attack, but they were vulnerable if internal fires reached them unchecked. With pumping systems damaged and firefighting capacity reduced, containment became increasingly unlikely. German survivors drifting in lifeboats later reported seeing a glow on the southern horizon for hours. They could not see details, only light against darkness. The timing of Sydney's final destruction cannot be known with certainty, but most reconstructions place it between 8 and 8:30 p.m. At some point, the inevitable occurred. Fire reached the forward magazine. The explosion that followed would have been catastrophic. Tons of high explosive shells detonating together would tear apart structural bulkheads and decks. The bow section, already weakened by torpedo impact, would have disintegrated under the blast. Anyone remaining in forward compartments would have died instantly. The stern, already flooding and possibly without propulsion, would have lost structural balance. Seawater rushing through ruptured sections would accelerate sinking. Within minutes, perhaps seconds, the remainder of the hull would have rolled and descended. No distress signal had been transmitted earlier in the battle. The radio room had been struck in the initial exchange. Without functioning transmitters and without command coordination, no formal call for help reached shore. The sea closed over the wreck. The factors that ensured total loss were cumulative. The initial destruction of the bridge removed centralized leadership. Early hits on communication systems prevented organized damage control. Torpedo damage below the waterline sealed the ship's fate from the outset. Fires spread without sufficient suppression. Escape routes were obstructed by heat and structural collapse. Darkness reduced visibility for any attempt at survival in open water. Those who might have abandoned ship faced severe obstacles: injury, exhaustion, limited flotation devices, and distance from land. Even in warm water, dehydration and exposure would have become critical within days. No confirmed Australian survivor was ever found. In contrast, Cormoran's crew had evacuated in daylight and in relative order before their ship was scuttled. They possessed lifeboats, supplies, and knowledge of their approximate position. Over the following days, 315 of the 399 Germans reached the Western Australian coast or were rescued at sea. The disparity was stark. 645 Australians vanished without trace. The combination of surprise, proximity, structural damage, and magazine explosion created conditions from which survival was highly improbable. In a matter of hours, one of the Royal Australian Navy's most celebrated ships had been reduced to wreckage 2.5 kilometres beneath the Indian Ocean. The battle ended not with surrender, but with annihilation. In the days following 19th November 1941, HMAS Sydney failed to arrive in Fremantle as scheduled. At first, naval authorities assumed minor delay. Mechanical issues or extended patrol were plausible explanations. By November 21st, concern intensified. Aircraft were dispatched to search expected routes. They found nothing. On 24th November, lifeboats carrying German sailors began reaching the Western Australian coast near Carnarvon. Over several days, 315 survivors from HSK Cormoran were recovered. Their account was direct. They had engaged and fatally damaged an Australian cruiser at close range. That cruiser, they stated, was Sydney. The news was received with disbelief. By the end of November, Australian authorities accepted the loss of the ship with all 645 aboard. It was the largest single ship disaster in the history of the Royal Australian Navy. Families across the country received formal notices. Many had no physical remains to bury. Grief was compounded by uncertainty. German prisoners, including Captain Theodor Detmers, were interrogated extensively. Their statements were compared and re-examined. Despite separate questioning, accounts remained broadly consistent. They described a short-range battle, heavy mutual damage, and the sight of Sydney drifting south in flames. None claimed to have witnessed her final explosion directly. A naval inquiry concluded that the loss resulted from tactical circumstances and the risks inherent in approaching an unidentified vessel too closely. There was no verified evidence of war crimes. Yet without wreckage or Australian survivors, doubts persisted. Rumours circulated that survivors had been fired upon in the water. Others questioned why no distress signal had been sent. The absence of physical proof allowed speculation to endure for decades. For 67 years, the exact location of both wrecks remained unknown. Search efforts were attempted intermittently, often limited by technology and funding. The depth of the Indian Ocean and the vast potential search area made success difficult. The loss became embedded in Australian public memory as an unresolved tragedy. In March 2008, a coordinated deep-sea search funded by the Finding Sydney Foundation achieved what earlier efforts had not. Using advanced sonar mapping, searchers located HSK Cormoran on 12th March at a depth of approximately 2,560 metres. 4 days later, on 16th March, HMAS Sydney was found about 20 kilometres away, resting at roughly 2,470 metres. The wrecks confirmed key elements of the German testimony. Sydney's bow section was shattered, consistent with a major internal explosion. Extensive fire damage was evident across the superstructure. Shell impacts matched a close-range exchange. The separation distance between the two sites supported accounts that the cruiser had drifted south before sinking. No evidence indicated deliberate attack on survivors. The discovery provided long-sought closure to many families. It also allowed historians to shift the narrative from conjecture to documented analysis. The wreck sites were declared war graves, protected under law. Strategically, the loss underscored the danger posed by disguised raiders and influenced naval doctrine. Procedures regarding identification and engagement were reassessed. Warships were instructed to maintain safer distances when challenging unknown vessels. Within weeks of Sydney's sinking, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Australia entered a new phase of war, facing direct threat in the Pacific. The earlier loss of Sydney sharpened awareness of vulnerability along Australian waters. Today, memorials commemorate the 645 men who did not return. Their names are inscribed at the HMAS Sydney Memorial in Geraldton. Annual services mark November 19th with quiet reflection rather than ceremony. The story altered national consciousness. It demonstrated how quickly confidence could be undone by deception and proximity. It revealed the limits of strength when procedure and surprise intersected. For decades, the cruiser was described as missing. Now she is located, but not recovered. She rests 2.5 kilometres below the surface, intact in part, broken in others, undisturbed. The Indian Ocean no longer conceals the facts, but it remains their keeper. 645 men sailed on routine patrol and did not return. Their ship became a grave and a lesson. The mystery endured for 2 generations. The resolution came not through rumour, but through evidence. HMAS Sydney is no longer lost. She is remembered.